I'm Marty Moss-Coane. Welcome to Radio Times. When Congressman Joe Sestak decided to run for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania and take on Republican Arlen Specter, he had his party behind him. Then Specter became a Democrat, and Sestak found himself in a tough primary battle with a veteran politician and with his party's leadership, who had rallied behind Arlen Specter. Well, Sestak went on to beat Specter handily, winning 54% of the votes. Now he's in a tough battle with conservative Republican Pat Toomey for the U.S. Senate in a closely watched race. Joe Sestak is our guest on Radio Times. He represented Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District. He served in the U.S. Navy for 31 years, rising to the rank of 3-star admiral. I should add that we have invited Pat Toomey to be a guest on the show, and we hope to book him soon. And Joe Sestak, nice to have you back with us on Radio Times.
And it's good to be back. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I have a question left over from the primary, and this goes back actually to February when Larry Kane, who's a broadcaster here in Philadelphia, asked you whether, and I'm quoting here, you were ever offered a federal job to get out of this race. You said yes. He said, was it Navy Secretary? Then you said no comment. And this was a question that really dogged you, and it actually dogged the Obama White House, because there were some concerns that they had actually offered you a real job, maybe even Secretary of Navy, to get out of the race. And as it turned out, you were offered a job, as you said in a press release, being on a presidential board without pay. I have to say that your unwillingness to be forthcoming on this, I think, has certainly raised questions during the primary about your honesty.
Well, I was asked a question that no one had ever asked, and when Larry King did it, so I thought I should answer honestly. Other politicians later told me I should have sidestepped the question, so I answered yes. But as you know, President Clinton had been the one that had been the messenger from the White House, and I had worked for him, and I would never place him in an embarrassing situation. I love the man, and by saying who had offered it. And I thought it was incumbent upon those at the White House to bring it out. But the real story, Marty, was that everybody knows that the White House, that the Washington establishment, even Harrisburg's Democratic establishment, wanted me out of the race. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, John F. Kennedy said it best. Sometimes the party asks too much. And I'll always stand on the side of Pennsylvanians when I think it's right, regardless of party. And that's the real story.
But you certainly created problems for the White House, because if they had offered you this job, it would have raised some questions about legality or illegality.
I didn't ask them to offer me the job, but I felt I should answer the honest question. But I also wanted to make it very clear. I'll always stand on the side of working families, because Washington, D.C. is, quite frankly, when I arrived there after 31 years in the Navy, I found them focused on large corporations, Wall Street, thinking some wealth might trickle down. No, look around Pennsylvania. When I went to those 67 counties I'd mentioned to you just before we got on the air, I met a farmer in Potter County. When I talked to him, I said, how's the recession? This is 2 Julys ago. He said, not too bad. I was hurting already so much. For far too long, people haven't been willing to lose their job in Washington over doing what's right, which is why, Marty, not only did I turn that down, but I also didn't run for my congressional job simultaneously when I could have when I ran for the Senate. It's not about my job. It's about people's jobs, and I want to become that type of senator.
I know that Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, was in town stumping for you. Bill Clinton was in town stumping for you. Is Arlen Specter going to stump for you as well? Is President Obama going to come to Pennsylvania?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the president is doing a wonderful event, fundraiser, on Monday. And Senator Specter, I just had a delightful discussion with his son, and I'm actually going, I want to go over to his office, the senator, and talk to him, and I've written him a note or two. Look, I also have to say this about Senator Specter. When he called me the night that I had won the primary, no one could have set a higher standard for graciousness. He called and said, Joe, congratulations. I will support you.
And you want his support?
He's a good man. He did good things for Pennsylvania. And there was a difference of opinion on some issues and others. But, at the end of the day, I learned, when I led men and women into harm's way, at the end of when it's over, come together and move forward.
President Obama has talked about a $50 billion package of spending to create infrastructure jobs, to focus on small businesses. Is this something that you would support?
I support. He has two portions, as you know. The small business, I'm all the way there, although I like my ideas even more. There's 15% tax credit because we've worked it through the modeling. But I'll support the small business. The infrastructure one I'll support, But it has to be paid for. Much like small business, it must be paid for because we must control the spending. When I got to Congress, during those early years of the Bush administration, my opponent, Congressman Toomey, and others threw out the window the requirement that government must balance its paycheck every year. That was called pay-as-you-go. We've now got that back in law. Now, infrastructure spending is important, but it'll take longer to get out there, maybe a year or so. So that's why if you can get the business tax cuts right to the small businesses right away, they're going to start going and then get into the community banks so they start lending again with capital. That's the real key, and that's why I support that number one.
Did you, if you had been in Congress last year, would you have supported the stimulus package, the auto bailout, the health care legislation?
Yes, because I was there.
Yes, and yes?
I was there. I went to Congress, as you probably know, and when I left the Navy, because my daughter had her brain tumor at 4 years old, given 3 to 9 months to live, this nation was there for a wonderful health care plan in the military. But we don't give a health care plan in the military because we're socialist or because we're anything but liberal. We're not a breeding ground for liberals. We do it because we have healthy, productive warriors who don't worry about their families and leave the military to go to another job so they have health care. We lose $150 billion a year because of the under and uninsured. So I went down to Congress to cover people, yes, but to start having a more productive economy. For example, small businesses, Marty, they pay 18% more for their health care than big corporations like Boeing because they can't spread the risk among of one person with cancer among 100,000 people. So now we let them spread the risk with all the businesses pooling their people, reducing their premiums 18%. On the other ones, those were tough votes. Did I want to do it?
Why were they tough?
They were tough because nobody wants to all of a sudden put money into salvaging something that's going down the tubes. But the key was that it wasn't just the 200,000 auto workers. There were over almost 1 million other workers, many in my district, who made parts for cars that would have gone under. If we hadn't done those things, Marty, we would have 8 million more uninsured today than we would have. And look, it's not just the loss of a job. If anybody, and I've seen it in my family, loses their job, they lose not just the job, they lose their dignity. We salvaged 8 million people. Now it's get this economy going with focus on small business. Tough votes, but sometimes that's what leadership is called for, not finger pointing, doing the right thing.
But and clearly Congress has passed a lot of legislation in spite of the atmospherics down there, and we're talking about not just TARP, but stimulus, auto bailout, and health care legislation. Why isn't there more public enthusiasm or support or even knowledge about what Congress did?
Well, you're right. I think three things. First, the TARP and the automobile is all being paid back with interest. The stimulus, when you look at all the debt that was accumulated during the Bush era, where they doubled our national debt from about $4 to almost $10 trillion, well, that's about 3% of it. But I think it's because leadership requires something different than my party, I think, provided. Two things.
Go ahead.
One is you got to get around and explain. And I think sometimes my party felt they were given a mandate, not an opportunity to lead. I think we should have been back explaining much better. Number two.
Well, let me stop you there because we have a president who, in many ways has a reputation for being a great orator. Are you saying that President Obama didn't do enough to sell and explain to the American people what he and the Democratic Party in Congress was doing?
I think the leadership as a whole of the Democratic Party did not. It's part of the reason I ran, because I felt that when I was captain of a ship, I would always, after 10 p.m. at night, 2200, the lights went off or something, I'd walk around the ship and just talk to the crew. Even when I was an admiral, after the planes came back from Iraq or Afghanistan, I think people felt you had to go down there. We were voted in for this and this and just do it. No, you got to walk around and explain things. I think everybody bears that out. And the second thing is, I think people have to understand, much like in the Navy, you look at your wake to see where you got to know where you're going. We have to remember that during 30 years ago, for example, Reagan took, good president, but he did take our national debt from $1 trillion to $4 trillion. Then Mr. Bush came in, Congressman Toomey, and they took our debt from $4 trillion to almost $10 trillion, even though Clinton had left it with the prospects of the largest budget surplus in the world. And so all of a sudden, do we want to do that again? Look, we had a hole that was dug, Marty. We had it dug. And we have to face that. It wasn't just handed over to Mr. Obama with a full, no hole. Okay, we took some tough steps. We have gained almost 1 million jobs here in the last 8 months, and we're moving forward. But that's why I'm arguing for small business tax cuts. We could have done better, but we did do at least stop the hemorrhaging of 8 million more jobs.
And that's Joe Sestak, our guest today on Radio Times, running for the U.S. Senate here in Pennsylvania in a tough fight with Pat Toomey. And as I said at the top of the hour, we have invited Pat Toomey to be a guest on the show. We are hoping to book him soon. Joe Sestak represented Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District, surprised, frankly, a lot of people when he beat Arlen Specter in the Democratic primary earlier this spring. Lines open at 1-888-477-9499. Stay with us. Call us. We'll be right back. This is Radio Times here on WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Marty Moss-Coane. Joe Sestak is our guest on the show. This is the first in what will be a series of candidate interviews over the next few months on Radio Times before the election in November. Joe Sestak running for the U.S. Senate. And we have calls coming in at 1-888-477-9499. That's 1-888-477-WHYY. I know you served in the Navy for 31 years. You refer to it often. How do you think the Senate is different from the Navy?
I think there are some similarities. I think leadership matters, and frankly, I find it lacking down there. Where's those titans, those ones that were willing to stand up and say, this is what needs to be done, but could also reach across the aisle on tough issues, energy, education, healthcare, to try to work with the others? Do I think leadership matters? I do. Do I think it's lacking? Yeah, it's part of the reason I ran.
Well, one of the criticisms coming from the Democratic Party, your party, is that the attempts to reach across the aisle have been, essentially rebuffed by the Republicans. There is very little interest in cooperation.
There are still moderate Republicans there to work with. Congressman Toomey, as you know, which is one of my concerns, when he was head of that Wall Street-founded special interest group as a lobbyist, his main job was to purge the Republican Party of moderates, Senator Chafee and Senator Collins and others. And so if you get more people in there like this, we are going to have this continual freeze in the Senate. But reaching across is very important. Can it be done? Yes. During the primary, there was a couple of Republican senators that would just call me and say, how's it going?
Like
who
who?
Are those?
Like who?
Just good people. And so my take on it is that, just checking in, I'd gotten to know them over the years. There was someone else, though, a different person, who came in and endorsed me, Senator Hagel, the Republican who just retired. He and I went to Iraq together, Vietnam vet. The independent mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, came in. Look, the military is not a breeding ground, as I mentioned, Marty, for liberals or conservatives or ideologues that don't face the facts. In fact, when I walked out of the Pentagon on 9/11, the plane slammed into that building 20 minutes later or so. People came out and didn't know. But the next night, the chief of naval operations called me and said, establish the Navy's anti-terrorism unit. We need one. It found me on the ground about 2 months later for a short mission in Afghanistan. But the issue was the next night when I called everybody together, it was all ideas were on the table. We have a problem to solve. We aren't, and that's how I approach my job down there. This country, I believe Pennsylvania especially, was so common sense, they want pragmatic solutions. They don't want an ideology. They don't want anybody extreme. They just want somebody. You got a problem, 900 people losing their health care every day? Let's see if we can work on it. Energy, we have China creating 100,000 jobs, and we hardly created any, and they're big in alternative energy, and they're exporting more solar power panels and wind turbines than anybody else. Let's solve the problem. Small businesses, tax credits for them and alternative energy. Let's solve the problems pragmatically.
Though you are running for the U.S. Senate, where in many ways the rules of the U.S. Senate gives the minority a lot of power and control. They can use the hold, they can use the threat of the filibuster in order to shut down any kind of movement on specific issues.
That was the second point, is organization. Leadership and organization. The one place that hasn't changed, it seems, in centuries is the Senate. I do believe in the protection of the minority, but when it's abused, no. So I am very supportive of, if you want to filibuster, go ahead, stay up all night. Maybe we close that down. Seniority. We should not have a reversal of the chairman down there. And those arcane rules that you can close down a subcommittee member if some of the one side doesn't show up, those are all. We have to change those rules. But leadership more than anything else. This nation just wants accountability in a leadership that matters to their lives every day.
But if you're talking about leadership, and if you're talking about your own party, you're talking about Harry Reid, you're talking about Nancy Pelosi, you're talking about Barack Obama.
I do believe that somehow there was a vacuum down there in Washington. People went there to change it. It didn't change. It's frankly why I ran in the primary. I felt that we were making a political calculation for a 60th vote. We didn't seize the White House through political calculation. We did it through audacity. Pennsylvanians don't always expect to agree with me, but they expect me to be upfront with them and working with them, and they just want to know, as I'm talking with them, to get a cut of my jib. That practical approach, day-to-day with them, not political calculation, the courage of one's conviction is what they want.
But where did that audacity go? And I know that Obama won Pennsylvania by 10 percentage points. It was he actually lost it in the primary to Hillary Clinton. And what you hear on the Republican side is a lot of anger, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of shouting and yelling, but nonetheless, you seem to have an engaged group of people on the Republican side, and you don't seem to see that same kind of enthusiasm on the Democratic side.
Well, first, I'm glad for any type of engagement, particularly when people are telling me not to be engaged in a race. We should be enticing people to be engaged. But look, when I went around that July, I found Democrats, when I was just meeting with them because 2 Julys ago, so it was a primary, they were a bit disenchanted because they really didn't know what was going on. Again, people I felt, down to Congress and weren't coming back. For example, in healthcare, we've now held over 20 healthcare summits, 4 since it was passed, 8 before last summer, 10 during the summer. That type of intercourse with one another and talking really helps. Doesn't mean everybody agrees with me. We invite the Tea Partiers to come to my healthcare summits. We send them emails. The last ones I had pictures with them outside, and then they came and, of course, told me their views. My point is that I think that type of dialogue somehow got lost. There was this sense of we weren't voted in there. No, to some degree the other party was voted out. But here's what's most important now. 3 million people lost their jobs the last 6 months of President Bush's tenure. 3 million lost it the first 6 months of President Obama's tenure. People have a right to feel slammed, their lives ripped apart through no fault of their own. And so, but now, leadership calls for saying, look, here's how we had to fill in the hole. And if we go back to the ways that got us in this, even with someone who's even more extreme, like Congressman Toomey wants to privatize Social Security and put it on Wall Street to gamble with, we won't be able to make it. I've got to earn that trust every day, Marty, and that's my job and my responsibility. I'm not looking to anyone in Washington to help. I'm looking to do it as a Pennsylvanian, to convince them I want to serve them, the middle class, and those who want to move into it.
And underscoring what you just said there, when the polls, and you can always take polls with a grain of salt, and nonetheless, there seems to be a consistent message, which is that people just don't believe Washington, Congress, even the White House can solve some of the really deep-seated problems in this country. A degree of pessimism, I think, that's kind of taken over many people's thoughts.
I do not want to at all try to make a Navy ship be the same as this wonderful country. But I've taken over ships where, the crew may not have been on the ups about what was going on. Leadership matters. That means explaining what you're standing on and showing that there's a way forward. For example, China. We know it's a big issue economically. Now, my opponent says, and we have to make this clear, that he supports China subsidizing its government subsidizing its foreign exports to make them cheaper for us, because even though people lose their jobs here, it's creative destruction. And they'll find other jobs, not worrying about the livelihoods. My belief is, wait a moment. Why are they violating the World Trade Organization rules? Let's enforce them. And I will do that as your senator, and I'm willing to lose my job over it. I find in Pennsylvania, maybe it's different in the nation, Pennsylvanians want to believe again, but they want a cut of my jib to say, are you willing to lose your job over doing it for me? I've got to convince them I am. But there is a way forward. We're Americans. We're going to do it. It's how quickly we do it with the right leadership. And
that's Joe Sestak, our guest today on Radio Times, running for the U.S. Senate here in Pennsylvania. He's a Democrat. He took on Republican-turned-Democrat Arlen Specter in the Pennsylvania primary. He beat Specter, and now he's in a pretty tough fight with the Republican Pat Toomey to represent Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate. And Joe Sestak represented Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District, also served in the U.S. Navy for 31 years, rising to the rank of 3-star admiral. What kinds of questions do you have for Joe Sestak? What do you want him to do if he wins the election in November and goes to Washington? 1-888-477-9499. That's 1-888-477-WHYY. Let me ask you about Marcellus Shale. It's actually our second hour today. We're going to take a look at the politics, the economics, and the environmental impact of gas drilling in Pennsylvania. On the one hand, this does represent jobs, and that's something that you are working hard to try to create here in Pennsylvania. On the other hand, there are environmental concerns, there are health concerns. I was reading that the Clean Air Act does not apply to hydraulic fracking, which is how you extract gas from Marcellus Shale. Where do you come down on gas drilling in Pennsylvania?
We must drill, but we must do it wisely and plan for it. The Halliburton loophole for the Clean Water Drinking Act forbids the Environmental Protection Agency to know even what chemicals they're putting in our water. 7 counties' drinking water have already been contaminated by fracking methane migration now. So let's get it right first with the right rules that Environmental Protection Agency of the state wants to do. Second,
which is essentially to force the companies to disclose the kinds of chemicals.
Absolutely, and had certain standards of drinking water, which the DEP, the state's Environmental Protection Agency, says you have to meet, and they're not. They're on demand, and they're being contaminated. Second, is this about jobs? You bet it is. But remember, Halliburton and other companies are bringing in, it takes 450 people to drill a well. Almost all of them, according to the Pennsylvania State's study, come from outside Pennsylvania. And after you drill 100 wells, you know how many are left? 19 permanent jobs. Wait a minute, let's pause and let's have our community colleges train Pennsylvanians to do the drilling and have those jobs. Third, excise tax. Let's exploit our resources, not our community. Why do the top 15 states that have natural gas supplies all have an excise tax except Pennsylvania? Man, if we get that, we can alleviate tax burdens on our seniors, have money for our roads, small business tax credits. It's a great fortune to us. And fourth, why drill? Mm-hmm. For the next 15 years, Pennsylvania could provide America's natural gas demand, cut oil emissions, the carbon emissions in half. But the thing I learned in the Navy is get it right at the beginning. Otherwise, we'll end up like anthracite coal mining, where you had $15 billion of cleanup to do on 2,000 miles of tributaries and waterways.
But we're not at the beginning now, though.
That's right.
We're at the we're
some
past that point.
So the ones we're drilling, drill. But let's pause for a moment. Get it right so we have no more of this contamination and do it right. Otherwise, those corporations, including ones from Japan and others, are doing the drilling and they're getting the profits. Let's take care of Pennsylvanians first. Their health, yes, but also the jobs. And third, let's get the profits from that too.
So essentially do what New York is doing.
Absolutely.
Which is
just pausing for a moment and do it right away. And that's why I've co-sponsored with Senator Casey the fracking bill to fix that Halliburton loophole. So let's have fairness. It's not just about, Congress Toomey says drill, drill, drill. He wants to drill in Lake Erie. Wait a moment. Let's look at the long term, get it all right so we benefit today and our children benefit also.
Let me get some callers in on the conversation at 1-888-477-9499. We have Jeff from Fairmount joining us on Radio Times. Jeff, go ahead. You're on the air.
Congressman, good morning.
Hi, Jeff.
I wanted to ask you about something in your own backyard, actually. Where do you stand on the airport expansion into Tinicum Township? I believe that's in your district, and from what I understand, the plans are that they want to expand the airport and move almost 100 families out of their homes.
Great question.
I was wondering where you stand on that issue, and also...
well, you know what, Jeff? Let's take that issue. It's an important one. We have a bunch of other callers as well. And
this is the exact kind of plan that government has not done well. They just want to bulldoze into Delaware County and have planes that will fly as low as 500 feet over schools and will be unsafe as they take off and turn more rapidly. Look, 35% of all planes that come into or out of Philadelphia International Airport come from less than 200 miles away. Many of these planes, and studies have been done, could fly into Jersey or other places, and we could alleviate by up to 12%, which is what this expansion is going to do anyway, the congestion in Philadelphia International Airport without harming the safety and the noise that will make children growing up in Delaware County and Chester County, by the way, it will be in grades for 12 years with these planes over, and we'll lose 1 grade of efficiency during that period of time because of the noise pollution. So let's do this right, and that's how I've been, and that's what I'm fighting for. And we can have the job creation. It just has to be done smartly in a multi-pronged approach. You know, here I am. You try to get from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia by public transportation. Do you fly? Do you take the train, which takes 5 or 6 hours? Think about a high-speed rail where China lays 11,000 miles this year and we're laying 0. There's a smarter approach to transportation to do in the future.
But that does require money and investment, federal dollars, maybe private dollars as well.
Absolutely, and that's why tax cuts like Congressman Toomey voted for corporations that invest in foreign factories today in China. Congressman Toomey says it's fine that they can keep their profits over there and not be taxed. If we close those down like I voted for, hasn't passed yet, sitting in that deep freeze of the Senate, and when I'm there I'm going to get it through, forces them to, I'm not going to be able to keep my profits over there, so I'm not getting a big tax benefit. I'll invest here and more jobs will be. Plus, we'll get more revenues because we close those billions of dollars that oil companies and big corporations get, and that's what he favors. That's what I oppose.
Jeff, thanks for the call. Let's get Bob from Kutztown to join our conversation. Hi, Bob. You're on Radio Times. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I applaud the congressman's comments about wanting to pay for the infrastructure bill that Obama has put forward. But what I wondered is why don't we have more information about raising the federal gas tax? The federal gas tax could pay for some of this. The last time the gas tax was raised was 1993 under President Clinton, and he used the gas tax entirely and specifically to reduce the national debt. It wasn't until 4 or 5 years later that the money was then put back into the Highway Trust Fund. It seemed to me if you raise the gas tax like 5 cents, Clinton raised it by 4.5 cents, 4.3 cents. Every time a person filled up with gas, if they filled up with 10 gallons, that would be right away.
Sure.
50 cents.
Well, Bob, it's a good point. Let me give Joe Sestak a chance to respond.
It's an excellent question because we have to pay for this. The reason I'm not supportive of a gas tax is I remember when I was running the first time as I left the Navy and gas prices had skyrocketed, and I watched small businessmen, contractors, all of a sudden the business is closing down. The gas prices were just causing them on their small profit margins not to be able to make a profit. And today when they've been slammed is not the time to do it. But we can get the revenues. When I'm talking, what we're doing now is trying to close tax shelters to get this small business bill through and the infrastructure one for tax shelters for large corporations overseas. We get that money. You can use it for the infrastructure. Look, there's a difference between Congressman Toomey and me. He honestly does believe we should eliminate all corporation taxes. He said that. He's been on TV and in his book. He proposes to pay for it a middle-class tax hike for 95% of working Americans of over $3,000, as he also proposes a $200,000 tax cut for millionaires. The reason he believes wealth trickles down, those ones that are there for the corporations close those, incentivize them then to invest here in America, and then you have the money for the infrastructure. Pay as you go. Balance the government book check. But why have we always favored Wall Street, big corporations, not middle-class Americans and small businesses?
Bob, thanks for calling into Radio Times. We'll talk more with our guest, Joe Sestak, running for the U.S. Senate here in Pennsylvania as a Democrat. Lines open, actually just one open line at 1-888-477-9499. Stay with us. Much more to talk about. We'll be right back.
The Nonprofit Center at LaSalle University supports WHYY and encourages nonprofit professionals who choose to think outside the box to utilize the Nonprofit Center for all their professional development needs. From fundraising to nonprofit management to leadership development, from full-day classes to personalized on-site training, the Nonprofit Center has the choices you need to succeed. Information at 215-951-1701 or online registration at www.lasallenonprofitcenter.org.
On the next Fresh Air, we talk with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. He's written a new book about what the Supreme Court does and why he interprets the Constitution as a living document, as opposed to the view of originalists who see the Constitution as fixed at the moment of framing. Join us for the next Fresh Air.
This afternoon at 3 and again tonight at 7 on WHYY.
I'm Robin Young. Join us next time for the news and these stories here and now. Savings accounts. You might be paying more in banking fees than you make in interest. What are some good alternatives? Also, Boardwalk Empire, the latest HBO gangster series to be set in New Jersey. That's Public Radio's daily digest of news and culture here and now.
Today at noon on WHYY.
This is Radio Times here on WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Marty Moss-Coane. My guest Joe Sestak took on Arlen Specter and the heavy hitters in his own party to beat the veteran senator in the Pennsylvania Democratic primary this past spring. Now Joe Sestak is in a tough fight with Republican Pat Toomey to represent Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate. And Joe Sestak, our guest today on Radio Times, the first in what will be a series of candidate interviews over the next 2 months before the November election. And we have a full bank of calls here, but let me just ask you about the Bush tax cuts, as they are called. They are set to expire at the end of the year. President Obama wants to essentially retain those tax cuts for individuals making up to $200,000, for couples making up to $250,000. Let the tax cuts expire for the upper income Americans. Do you support the president on this?
I do, because the middle class tax cuts have to be extended and eventually maybe even lowered if we can do that. Second is, look, President Bush and Congressman Toomey never paid for these tax cuts. They added $2 trillion to our debt. You and I, Marty, and my child, and everybody now has $15,000 of additional debt to pay off because we never paid for them. But also remember, the top 2% got over 50% of the tax cuts when they were given. And the wealth up there has, in the last 20-plus years, increased almost 300%, but middle class has only increased about 25%. So we got to start paying our debt. This is just a tough choice, but we got to start paying for things, but not put it on the middle class. And Congress Toomey and I disagree. He just wants to, let the very well-to-do who, I just continue on and add another $700 billion unpaid for to our taxes, our debt.
Can this country help the middle class, which has been hurt, as we know, over the last couple of decades, essentially either treading water or even losing ground, especially when it comes to men who have been losing ground under this economy. But can we help the middle class without creating a debt that overwhelms essentially their children or their grandchildren? Well,
we can if we do two things. One, we have reinstituted the requirement that a government on mandatory spending, like Medicare, Medicaid, that you want a new program, you got to cut another one. That is what Pat Toomey, Congressman Toomey, and George Bush threw out and added, when they did Medicare D, it added $1 million more to our debt. Second, we must get a cap on discretionary spending, the Pentagon and others, and I know that. To where you have a tongue suppressor. So that's number one. But second is, we also know the middle class, the majority of whom work in small businesses, if you give them tax credit, they create 80% of all jobs, not large corporations where Congress Toomey wants to eliminate taxes, and then you get the revenues from the new jobs that are created. That's the key. That's the key. That's why you want to invest in middle class and small business tax credits.
Just a quick follow-up there, though, but what's also faltering is consumer demand, which drives so much of the economy. How do you essentially create demand without putting people deeper into debt?
Very good, and thank you for that, because that's why when I voted and went down for FMAP, the Medicaid, or the unemployment checks where people had lost their jobs, Congress to me was opposed to those. But by doing that, not only did you have people get that $200 a week where they might just be able to feed their children, but you also had their demand stay up enough. Without that, the demand will go down. Look, people can argue about what we did, but we know 8 million more people would have been lost in their jobs without it, because people would have been laid off from the job because no demand would have been there. So keeping that going, because they were slammed to no fault of their own, as we do these small business tax cuts, make sure the middle class doesn't get a burden of taking away their middle class taxes they have now. They'll keep spending and they'll start creating jobs as long as we get community banks lending again. And that's why we should guarantee their loans to credit-worthy businessmen and women, small businessmen and women, up to about 98%. And then they'll be less worried about lending. It's going to work.
Let me get Matthew from Media to join our conversation. Matthew, go ahead. You're on Radio Times.
Hi, Mr. Congressman.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you for taking my call.
Thanks, Joe, please.
In full disclosure, I'm a big supporter of yours, have been since you first ran in 2006. But as everybody, I'm very concerned about jobs. During the 2008 presidential election, there was a lot of talk about outsourcing and the issue of outsourcing and the loss of jobs from America to other countries. And I have not heard that brought up in a discussion anymore in all of this discussion about job creation and preventing more job loss. And I'm wondering if you, the Congress, the President, are considering this, if this is still on the table, either tax hikes for companies who outsource our jobs or something like that.
Fair enough. Matthew, thanks for the call.
I just spoke about that, as I was telling Marty before I came here, to a group of workers in North Philadelphia. This is a stark contrast, I told them, between Congressman Toomey and me. Look, he worked for a billionaire in Hong Kong after he left Wall Street and went down to Hong Kong, a Chinese billionaire. And he's written in his book that he supports corporations not only having no taxes, but that we should permit China to subsidize their foreign exports to us. And we should let corporations that invest in overseas factories not have to have their profits taxed. He's actually voted for that. So what happens is we're outsourcing jobs because corporations get a tax break for investing in China. Then their goods are subsidized at a lower rate and come back here and we displace more jobs. I want to end those. I have voted to close those taxes several times. Can't get them through that deep freeze of the Senate. There's too many extremists there, and we can't add another one in Congressman Toomey. Second, we have to take on the World Trade Organization, China. It owns a lot of our debt because Congressman Toomey with the President Bush doubled our national debt. They own a lot of it, and if they dump it all of a sudden, it could be tough. But as a recent article said, their government is buying the land for these corporations. Their government is giving them free loans so that they ship it back to us at low prices. That's against the rules. And we need a tough legislation, which I have worked on down in the House, to get it through the Senate and stop this type of unfair trade practices. You know, NAFTA, we lost 68,000 jobs here in Pennsylvania, which Congressman Toomey proposed, and those were supported. And those people didn't just lose their jobs, they went to less good paying jobs. Let's invest here in America by stopping the tax credits overseas to have U.S. corporations invest there. And second, enforce the rules for fair trade.
Matthew, thanks for calling in. Let's see what Dave from Abington has to say. And Dave, you're on Radio Times. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to ask about our military budget. I'm not sure what the numbers are these days.
About $700 billion. Yes.
$700 billion.
Right.
Why is this such a... It seems like the elephant in the room. I rarely hear politicians talking about why we need it. Why are we guarding Germany? And we have bases all over the world, soldiers in harm's way, in so many places. Is this really necessary? And I'm reminded of the old phrase, when you only pull the hammer, everything is a nail. It just doesn't seem even closely reasonable.
Well, Dave, it's a good question, and Joe Sestak, go ahead.
As the highest-ranking military officer ever elected to the Senate or to Congress in the history of the nation, this is something I intend to work strongly on in the Senate and become a leader on foreign and national security affairs. The military right now, and I have written about this, I worked in this in my last job as a 3-star admiral, is building a good military, but not the most cost-efficient or effective. We still measure our prowess, our ability to do things, and how many things we have, how many planes, how many ships. My last year in the Navy, I advocated instead of 315 ships, 250 ships, but some of the money would be moved over into systems that help you know where the bad guy is. Imagine if we had the intelligence systems that knew where Osama bin Laden is. Imagine if we had known that Iraq was going to be invaded by Saddam Hussein. We might not be there now. And that type of knowledge-based system, some of what's in what we call in the military the black world, is less expensive. And we have to recognize we'd have a better military if we know, then you need less platforms to get. And that's a massive change that has to be done. And Secretary Gates beginning it, and I supported him almost alone in the House of Representatives, and I'm going to continue to do that because you can't afford the Cold War systems that we are still procuring.
And just picking up on Dave's question, though, would you then favor then closing the air base in Germany, looking at the air base or the military bases in Germany and Japan, which are a vestige of the Cold War?
Without a question, it is a matter of where you have them based. It's called posture. So, for example, we know that we have a ship in Japan, an aircraft carrier. We know to defend a small island off Taiwan, let's say, we need 2 aircraft carriers if somebody were to invade that island. If one's in San Diego, to keep one up there at all times, it takes about 4 ships to keep rotating them. But if you took that ship and instead put it in Guam, you don't need the other 3 ships to keep it rotating. So actually where you base things forward for rapidity of response, and then if you have the intelligence systems to know how to quickly get there, those are the 2 ingredients of future warfare. The right posture, where you want to be, with the intelligence that turns it into not information, but knowledge to quickly get the force there. So when I said Saddam Hussein was coming into Kuwait, we would have nicely to have a carrier there that could have said, boom, here you go, today's not your day. So it's the right posture in there. And then you save those other vessels, for example, that you don't need to keep the rotation. Because you only need 2 for the conflict. You don't need all 5.
But what do you do about Afghanistan? And as we know, that the president increased the troop level, he reduced the troop level in Iraq, focusing on Afghanistan, seeing this as the so-called or the quote-unquote war on terrorism.
I supported this plan for the reason that 2 marches ago he said, as I believed, the real focus of our mission in Afghanistan is Al-Qaeda that's now in Pakistan. If Pakistan fails, there is not only the nuclear weapons there, but 2,000 trained scientists in the most radical of Islamic universities that have the knowledge to rebuild them, even if you get the nuclear weapons out, with the Taliban there and Al-Qaeda. Then the global war terror can be much higher. The troops were supposed to, as we were told in a closed hearing, help seal the border as we convince Pakistan to go after the Taliban on their side of the border so they can't flee across it and get the Al-Qaeda. That's the sole reason I am supporting it. We were doing that.
But that's
war.
not what we're doing in Afghanistan.
No, correct. The president promised us measurements, he said. In his speech 2 marches ago, he said that would be the principal focus. Number 2, he said no open blank check. We'd have metrics to measure our performance. Remember, I come from the military. I like practical solutions. We're not liberals. We're not conservatives. Give me the problem and let me measure it, how to do it. We haven't gotten that, and I've written the president twice, and General Jones, head of the NSC, National Security Council, has written me back to say, Mr. President, where are the metrics for Pakistan? Because Afghanistan has gone so far south, I believe you can't rely upon Karzai there, the president, or the corruption. We just have to finish the job of Al-Qaeda that threatens us, and then remove ourselves. But if we don't have the measurements...
But finish Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Or
Al-Qaeda is no longer in... There's no Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They have a safe haven from which they can plan the leadership in Pakistan. And that's the real reason. It's almost like a base to try to exterminate since we can't put troops there. But if we don't get the measurements, the public cannot continue to support an open-ended community. We need those, and I've continuously asked for them.
Just a quick follow-up, then we'll get back to the calls. But are you saying that the U.S. should pressure Pakistan to get rid of Al-Qaeda, or that the U.S. should go into Pakistan and deal with the problem
We are
ourselves?
giving them covert assistance, but with Pakistan, the Taliban came within 6 60 miles of their capital. It was like they remembered what Samuel Johnson said centuries ago. There's nothing like the prospect of a hanging to focus your mind. They took 3 divisions away from the India border, and they're now going after them. We're sealing the border, and now we have to make sure that in those metrics, are they still going after the Taliban, and are they getting al-Qaeda with our covert assistance from across the border? That's the key. But we need to have the metrics to see if it's successful. Otherwise, you can't ask us to keep pouring in public treasure into something in an open-ended commitment. Good purpose, good strategy, but I need metrics to see if we're continually being done right.
Let me get Chris from Villanova to join us on Radio Times. Hi, Chris. Go ahead. You're on the air. Okay, you're on the air.
You campaigned for Bill Clinton yesterday. Bill Clinton supported the same financial deregulation legislation that you attacked Pat Toomey for. Do you think President Bill Clinton caused a financial crisis? And if so, isn't it hypocritical of you to campaign with him?
Well, and it's interesting, Chris, that you said that that our guest, Joe Sestak, was campaigning for Bill Clinton, but nonetheless, it was actually the other way around. But your question is a good one. Go ahead.
You know, I had Senator Durgan up the other day, one of 8 senators who came up to support me, who stood up and said that bill was wrong. And that's the difference between Congressman Toomey and me. He went with the pack. He just says, well, everybody else did it. But in fact, he left Wall Street after making a fortune. I applaud him for that. He then went to Congress and actually helped shape that legislation. Whether others were there, I stood up to my party when it was wrong in the primary.
But this is a question about Bill Clinton, though.
Right. Yeah, I don't agree with that decision by him. But I don't agree with when President Obama and Governor Rendell and others said, sit down, we don't want you to run the primary. I will always do what's right for Pennsylvanians. That's the point. But Congressman Toomey, remember this, after he left shaping that legislation and went to Club for Growth, the Wall Street founded special interest as a lobbyist, and then said we should take Social Security and stick it into Wall Street to be gambled with. So there's a difference. He goes with the extremes. I will always go with what's right for Pennsylvania, standing up to the presidents even when they're wrong.
We're almost out of time here, but Pat Toomey has called you a liberal. Is he correct? Are you a liberal?
The military, as I said time and again, when you're on the ground in Afghanistan or Community Care Battle Group, we don't breed liberals or conservatives, but especially not ideologues. Well, Congressman Toomey broke no dissent. His job, as the Philadelphia Inquirer said, was to be the head person to purge moderate Republicans out of the Republican Party. If we become that extreme, and Pennsylvanians are too commonsensical, if this Senate becomes that extreme, nothing will be done. That's the key. I just want to work across the aisle. That's why Senator Hagel, Republican, Mayor Bloomberg, Independent, and others come in to support me. I have worked more pieces of legislation in my first 2 years in Congress than any other congressman down there who was of my class because we work across the aisle pragmatically.
And very quickly, are you going to play with Bob Brady to try to win Philadelphia?
I just saw Bob this morning. Great introduction with him and a great mentor.
Joe Sestak, thank you for joining us today on Radio Times, running for the U.S. Senate here in Pennsylvania. And as I said several times during the hour, we have invited Republican Pat Toomey, who also wants to represent Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate, to be a guest on Radio Times. And over the next 6 weeks or so, we'll be featuring a series of candidate interviews on Radio Times, and we hope you can join us for all of them. Go to WHYY.org/Radio Times and find out much more about the program. I'm Marty Moss-Coane. You are listening to WHYY-FM Philadelphia and WHYY.org. Member supported.